it's Kat and I'm back because what once was will be again. I got my tiki cap on because we are going to talk about ice and fire. We're going to try to divine a few more mysteries. I'm doing a little series here to try to put together the steps to determine who's who and where Jon Snow's parentage might come from. Because this is a song of ice and fire. So if you see part 1, that's what I talked about. I said, this is not about Lyanna and Rhaegar or a petty squabble over a throne down in Westeros. There's an overarching story about a struggle or a war between ice and fire. And that struggle ended with some sort of compact or compromise that might have, in fact, included some sort of marriage, as medieval people did to seal compacts. And I talked about how the others were made and through what kind of magic, how their magic was, how the magic of winter was imbued into the man. And I said that if there was such a thing that happened to the others, that they were made by magical means, that there's a possibility that that happened to beings of fire as well. Part 2 was really just me saying, look at this constant, it's ice and fire. The logic of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark does not compute, because if they were together, then their child would have been the prince that was promised, because it would have been the Prince of Spring. But guess what? That's not what happened. I know. I'll tell you how we know the Prince of Spring is the prince that was promised in another section. But essentially, what has to happen is we're still needing one ice and one fire. And if Jon Snow's the ice and Daenerys is the fire, then Jon Snow has to have parentage of ice. He can't have fire plus ice. Okay? It's illogical. Does not compute. Oh, and in section 3, I just kind of talked about the thing that I brought up in part 2. Like, what was so special about the Starks? Why are they ice? Or why is Lyanna Stark even ice? And I think that's an important question, because I don't think that she was ice by herself. Okay? You have to look at the Starks, because otherwise all the Starks could potentially be ice. So why Lyanna Stark? Except for unless you go back to the theory of Rhaegar Targaryen plus Lyanna equals Jon, and he was looking for a female, obviously, to have a child. But I still don't think that's right. So check out part 1, part 2, and part 3. What are the indicators? And now we're going to talk about how the Starks probably have some bloodline that may compute with ice, that may make them even more compatible and or desirable to be the ice. So first thing we know is that these Starks are the blood of the first men, largely. Although they may have intermarried with some of the Andals, that it is known that they stopped the Andal invasion at the neck. They didn't go any further north. And those other families down south in Westeros have more Andal blood. But they might have intermarried and had some Andal blood come up north with them. But those wildlings who are above the wall are almost all, as far as people know, largely of the first men. So this is one aspect in which the Starks and the wildlings share a common ancestry. But there may be some other incidents in which they actually share straight-on bloodlines through some sort of interactions and or intermarriage. So one of the things that I heard in this process was about the song of Bael the Bard. So if you remember, Ygritte and Jon are walking around up north, and she says, "Do you know the story of Bael the Bard?" And he's like, "What?" And she goes, "You know nothing, Jon Snow." So you really had to go look up the lyrics for Bael the Bard, or at least the story of Bael the Bard. She talks about how he plucked the rose of Winterfell. And this is exactly what happened. So Bael the Bard was Bael the king beyond the wall, and the king of winter, Brandon Stark, had only daughters. He made some comment about Bael being a coward. So Bael went across the wall, climbed into Winterfell, posed as a bard, sang a song, and the king of winter, Brandon Stark, was like, "That was great. What would you like as a gift?" He said, "The most beautiful flower in Winterfell's garden." So, of course, King Brandon went out and plucked a lovely blue winter rose and handed it to Bael the Bard. And later the next morning, when everybody woke up, they found this flower in the bed of the Lord's eldest daughter, who went missing for about a year, and then she showed back up with a baby. Well, and it was fortunate for the Starks because they had no sons, and so this child was legitimized to become the Lord Stark instead of a Snow. Otherwise, so you could see that it's through the female line plus a wildling. Okay, and as the story goes, it has somewhat of a tragic end that this son grew up to be the next Lord of Winterfell, and out while he was ranging and he ran across some wildlings, they attacked, there was some sort of fight. Bael realized that that was his son, so he refused to fight, but his son took his head anyways, put it on a pike, carried it back to Winterfell, and presented it to everybody. His mother saw it, realized that it was the man she had loved this whole time, and threw herself out the window. Shortly after, apparently, this lord had ended up dying. So, so I find this very interesting because this actually suggests a storyline that we've already seen in the story. Now, a lot of people point to this and say, look, Rhaegar Targaryen gave whatchamacallit Lyanna some blue winter roses. They were her favorites, and he was a bard. He sang. And then, you know, after he stole away with her for about a year, he died. Which actually isn't how the Bael the Bard story went. And I thought that the most interesting aspects were that, yeah, Mance Rayder had shown himself to have, at least on 1, 2, possibly more occasions, snuck into Winterfell and acted like a bard so that he could interact. And we don't know how many times that was. But he obviously knew the song about Bael the Bard. And he had been back to the castle sometime when Jon Snow was very, very young, as was Robb Stark. So Ned was there, and there was small children. That's what I understood. So, so we get the impression that Mance Rayder had been there more than once. A lot of people are disregarding that because it's like, no, that doesn't make sense. When would he have been there? As many times as he wanted, apparently. Based on the books. You don't see that in the storyline. But in the television series, what I thought was interesting was that Mance Rayder was being burned at the stake, and then Jon Snow shot him with an arrow. So he killed Bael the Bard, or Abel the Bard, at that point. And then shortly thereafter, Jon Snow died. That's when he was stabbed. Okay, and now we're going to take about 10 seconds and talk about the Greek mythology that's behind this whole story. It would be basically Oedipus, or Oedipus, i.e. the Oedipus complex, although without the mother love involved. So if you know the story of Oedipus, his father landed on the island, fell in love with the princess, knew he couldn't take her, got the chick pregnant, and then sailed away. He did leave his sword and something else buried beneath a rock, and told the woman that when the son grew up to give him the sword and to come find him, and he would know who he was, and he would know his son, and he would take care of him. So yes, the son grows up, gets the sword, goes to find his father. On his way there, he meets this dude in a chariot. They have words. Oedipus kills him. Goes to the castle, marries the woman who is there. And turns out that that was his father in the chariot. And because he slept with his whomever, he puts his own eyes out and dies from stab wounds. Something like that. But in any event, I think the other aspect that I was interested in the Oedipus complex here was, or the Oedipus story, was the sword. He leaves him a sword to find. So, we're back to that sword thing. So, I want you to think about that. I'm not saying it has to be Mance Rayder, but I am more in favor of Mance Rayder than I ever was of Howland Reed, and super more than Rhaegar Targaryen. Just because. And just because she had blue roses at the end doesn't mean that was her love gift of Rhaegar Targaryen that she was holding on to for love. And we'll come back to that at the end. But, alright, but we're going to leave that apart. So Bael the Bard, for sure, interacted with the Starks and left them as part of their bloodline. So the thing that we know about the others and the Wildlings is that Osha tells Bran and Rickon while they're traveling towards the wall that the others have been breeding with the Wildling women. That for the last one they woke up ever since that frickin' red comet, that they were breeding with the Wildling women and creating half other, half human children. And this reminds me to keep an eye out on Mance Rayder's backstory, because Mance Rayder's backstory is that he is a Wildling child that is somehow left behind during a Wildling raid for the Night's Watch to pick up, in which they do, and they raise him at least until a certain age where he decides that he's going to run off and go beyond the wall. And then we saw this thing with Craster at Craster's Keep. So Craster had been having male and female children, but he was putting the male children out to the others, and they were coming, and we saw them turn them with a touch on the cheek. So they weren't killing them, they were turning them, putting some of this ice or other god aspect into them, and apparently raising them. So a lot of people are like, well, he was just sacrificing them for his own security, which might be true, but you get the idea that he might have actually had some sort of clue, because he tells Jon Snow that these are the real gods, and you better get right with the real gods or else. And we know that when we look back to how the others were made and how the guy was tied to the all tree with the dragon glass, that in fact the others are some aspect of the real gods. You know, the god aspect. So he's not totally crazy. And what else is he doing is that he is having relationships not only with his daughters but with his granddaughters. Why do you do that? Well, when you're breeding animals, for instance, that is to maintain the purity or create a purity in their bloodline. So by doing that, you essentially would eventually breed out any impurity in the bloodlines, and it would be mostly just yours. And we understand that they have this idea in their heads about the continuation, that when you give them your seed, you give them your soul. So really what he's doing is he's stacking the deck, because he knows that his children of his seed and his progeny are going to be of these others, and they are essentially going to intermix with the rest. So whose bloodline is going to potentially be of the next Night's King or of the gods? That's what he's doing. Okay. So we get the idea that they're mating, and they might actually have, through other interactions, had relationships with people south of the wall. So these Wildlings that may have other blood may have relationships with people south of the wall, whether it's Mance Rayder or not. Okay, and this is where I got the idea that it's not Lyanna Stark by herself, but that she had to have some sort of consort or relationship with a person of ice. And that could be either a person who is a Wildling or a Wildling with some other blood involved. So we're going to leave it at that, because we'll talk about Rhaegar and Lyanna and what I think was going on with them on another video. But next we're going to talk about the mythology that surrounds all this and kind of ties up our ideas. And we're going to talk about the prince that was promised as well. Thank you very much. Talk to you later. Hit the like button.